And the book came out in 2020. This is the link. It's actually open access, but obviously you can also buy it in, wherever the main bookshops, Amazon, etc. So just what's the context we're working on? So the Twendembele program did some research in 3 African countries, actually done it more, but this is reporting on 3. And some of the issues are cultural issues, which affect how monitoring and evaluation is used. So you can see a significant proportion of managers, 30-odd%, resist transparent decision-making. There's about 30% who had little respect for the use of evidence. In about 40% of cases, managers said it was difficult to discuss performance objectively because of the hierarchy. Around 50% senior managers, they've said that senior managers fear admitting mistakes or problems. And particularly that last one, I think, which is really critical, around 45% said problems are not seen as an opportunity for learning and improvement. And really, for evaluations to make a difference, you need to have a culture where you're looking to see what's not working well so you can improve it. But if the bureaucracy, and many bureaucracies are like this, there's a fear of admitting failure, it makes it difficult to improve. And so, this is the culture, that the compliance culture that we're operating in, that we need to try and change. So I'm going to just show you the analytical framework that we developed, and I think this is an important contribution in itself. And it was basically to try and structure the research and the tacit knowledge evidence base to allow us to identify patterns in what the research was bringing up, and this would allow us to get the cross-learning and collaborations around the learnings around different evidence-informed decision-making interventions and approaches. So this is actually the framework, and I'm going to go through it in more detail. And it starts with the demand for evidence. And what we said, when you look at a lot of the literature around evidence use, it starts with a researcher trying to push the evidence they've generated. In this research, we rather started with the governments that are interested in evidence. There is demand for evidence, and how does that process happen? So we took a slightly different, a policy-orientated approach here. And based on that demand, then some evidence is generated. And this could be a different, it could be evaluations, it could be research, it could be satellite data, it could be whatever. And there are issues about the quality or rigor, and there are other issues, for example, timeliness, which matter in terms of that evidence generation. And then based on that evidence generation, there are potentially some what we called use interventions which are applied, which help to facilitate the openness and the access and use of the evidence. And it might be that there's training and capacity building, it might be that there's some awareness raising things that are done, it might be trying to make sure there's access to the evidence, it might be trying to work with particular champions. And the critical thing I think that this research offered was for us to start to be purposive about what these use generations are and these use interventions are, and how we can start to be not just thinking about how do we supply evidence, but how do we become good at using use interventions to make evidence, policymakers want to use the evidence and use it. And if we do those use interventions, these are triggering, we suggest, these 6 behavioral change aspects: awareness, agreement, access, trust, the ability, and institutionalization. And so these use interventions need to think about which of these do we need to try and trigger. Do we need to try and trigger awareness? Do we need to try and trigger access? Because what you're trying to do with this is to build the motivation to use evidence, or the capability to use evidence, or the opportunity to use evidence. This is a behavior change model. So we need policymakers to have the motivation, to have the capability, and to have the opportunity to use evidence. And it's these change mechanisms which trigger that. So what use interventions do we need to do to trigger those change mechanisms that will lead to that capability, motivation, and opportunity? And if that happens, then we hope that evidence will be used. And we talk about different types of use. I'll come back to that. And then we hope that if evidence is used, there will be a development impact, because that evidence is helping to choose interventions which work and how they should work rather than those which don't work, etc. And this is all happening within a context. And it's very important that we do this within, that it's context related. So instead of what's called isomorphic mimicry of imitating systems from elsewhere, we can take the principles that have worked elsewhere and say, but how would we apply this in our context? And there's an external context, which is, for example, the overall culture in government, the way different levels of government interact and interrelate. And then there are internal development dimensions, which are like the culture within specific departments, the capacity, the management, the resources, etc. But things don't happen in this neat linear way. Actually, there's constant feedback between the step. You might do a bit of evidence generation, and then you do a use intervention, and then you say, no, we need more evidence, and then you do that, and then this starts to trigger the change. So it's not necessarily a linear process. But if you start to think about this framework in a conscious way, you start to say, what if we're going to get this motivation, capability, and opportunity to happen, what change mechanisms do we have to use? What use interventions do we need to apply? And of course, what evidence do we need to generate? So when we look at the changes which happened in these African cases, in most cases, we saw policy change or legislation. So remembering there were these 8 cases, 4 were evaluations, 4 were other things. In most cases, we saw changes in procedures and processes which happened because of using the evidence. But only in a few cases did we see budgets changed. And in this one particular case, it's a very interesting chapter in the book actually about violence against women and children. The budget increased by $13 million. And then in the 1 year, and $22 million in the next year. So there was a direct link between the process that happened and increasing the budget. So this is the evidence use part of the framework. And in terms of the type of use, we see conceptual use, where the evidence is used to widen people's understanding of how things work, or the problem. This was widespread. We see process use, where because of and both conceptual and process use can happen during the evaluation. They don't wait till the end of the evaluation. So for example, in one of the programs, which was a teacher bursary program, the theory of change workshop that we did early on in the evaluation was quite powerful for stakeholders who really began to understand how this program was supposed to work and what the issues were around this. This was very early on in the evaluation process. And Michael Patton's written a lot about process use. The process use is very important and it's underestimated. Okay, so these uses that I showed you here were instrumental changes. So these were, it recommended there should be a policy change. It recommended this procedure should change. It recommended this budget should change. And these changes happened. That was instrumental use. But now we're seeing that the conceptual and process use, which can happen at all stages of the evaluation process, are just as useful. We also see symbolic use. So symbolic use is sometimes used to refer to where evaluations are taken to justify an existing policy position. In other words, it's not a real, genuine inquiry. It's being done symbolically to just justify what the policymakers thought anyway. Yeah, that's what I call negative symbolic use. But there's also positive symbolic use. So for example, in Uganda, it demonstrated to the Public Procurement Development Agency the importance of evaluations to review their regulations and guidelines. And in another case in South Africa, not within this book, by doing an evaluation of nutrition interventions for children under 5, it raised the profile of nutrition in a big way. So that's what I call positive symbolic use. You won't find that in the literature, except my literature on this. It's a different thing that we've added. But there are also unintended uses. And I think one of the lessons that's coming from thinking in a broader way about how evaluations can be transformational is it's about looking for unintended uses and unintended consequences, not just the intended ones, which the program is probably looking for. And there are a number of those that were identified here. I'm not going to mention them. So this is, how evidence is used. Now, I mentioned that what we're trying to do is use changes in capability, motivation, or opportunity to lead to use. So what do we see in terms of changes in capability? The capability to generate and use evidence, to advocate for the program or the policy for funding. So for example, in the Benin agriculture evaluation that we looked at, the producer organization's capacity was strengthened through the process. And this led to the evaluation being used in a powerful way later with very strong advocacy by these producer organizations. Secondly, what do we see in terms of changes in motivation to use evidence? So moving away from a compliance approach to an actual genuine motivation. So for example, in the Parliament of Kenya, used the experience with the Wildlife Act, which is one of the case studies in the book, to develop guidelines for citizen engagement and participation in Parliament across the board, not just in the particular act that they were looking at in this particular case, but broadly. So that was, they were motivated by what happened, and that motivated them to not only to use the evidence in the particular case, but to take that case and apply it more widely. And what about opportunities? So for example, in the violence case, in parallel to what was happening with the evaluation, there was a dialogue that had been organized, which involved National Treasury, the Ministry of Finance. And the dialogue provided an opportunity to discuss the evidence and use the evidence and use that to advocate for changes in budgets. So that was where a new opportunity was created. And in many cases, what we see, it's this combination of these three elements, which is leading to significant and sustained change. So one of the core messages from this presentation is think about how you build the capability, motivation, and opportunity to use evidence, not just how do I do a good evaluation. And if you're going to do that, you need to think about these change mechanisms. How do we build people's awareness? How do we build their agreement, understanding, or commitment? How do we build the access to evidence? How do we build the interaction between those generating the evidence and those using the evidence, and the trust between them, so the evidence, when it comes out, will be trusted, and therefore the policymakers will want to use it? How do we build the ability and confidence in stakeholders to actually use the evidence, and so they're more likely to use it? And how do we build institutionalized opportunities for the evidence to be used? So there's a critical role. I mean, one of the things that's come through from this work is relationships matter a lot. And so building the good relationships, which is the trust here, between the suppliers, the policy. So now, these are the 6 mechanisms. Sorry, my phone's just ringing. I'll just switch it off. Okay. What do we see? So in terms of
Dr. Goldman, you are a little breaking up. Could you speak a little bit slow so we can catch up? Thank you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, it's much better
Yes?
now. Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
all right.
Yeah.
Okay, so so what did we see in the research about building awareness of the potential of evidence? We saw examples of training senior managers in the public service. We saw training of citizens groups in Ghana to analyze and utilize data to demand accountability in embedded services. What did we see in terms of trying to build agreement, understanding, and commitment? We saw dialogue processes, for example, in that violence case. We saw how evaluation steering committees were used to formalize partnerships between the different stakeholders involved in the intervention, and how, when those steering committees were managed well, they helped to build trust between those stakeholders. So the process side is very important. But one of the general messages is the process side is as important as the product. So managing the evaluation process well is just as important as trying to get the technical quality right. In terms of access to evidence, producing accessible short reports and policy briefs, using workshops, using knowledge repositories, these were all types of use interventions to try and promote access. In terms of interaction, building an interaction and trust, the use of dialogue processes, active knowledge brokering by monitoring and evaluation units in government, using multiple opportunities to build interest and trust from policymakers. So for example, trying to maybe have breakfast meetings with policymakers to talk about what was coming up with the evidence, not necessarily using a formal meeting. Using networks and communities of practice. And then in terms of building ability and confidence, we saw capacity building interventions like learning by doing, workshops, we saw coaching and mentoring, we saw experiential learning, we saw online learning. And we could see examples of trying to institutionalize and formalize through management responses and improvement plan, through embedding support, for example, through knowledge brokers, through the institutionalization that came from a national evaluation system, and through making public the evaluation results. So these are showing the link between the change mechanisms and the use interventions to try and build that capability, opportunity, and motivation. So we saw there were quite a number of elements. So if you, as you mentioned, Moon, that you're building an evaluation system in Korea, so many of the things that help to make evidence use can happen through a national evaluation system. So these are some of the things that we found that were elements of national evaluation systems, particularly in Benin, Uganda, and South Africa, which have national evaluation systems, which help to build use. And then we saw a number of other areas which were not part of the national evaluation system, which also promoted use. I'm not going to go through them. You can get them, and it's in the book, of course. But you can see there are a range of things which are in the system, which help, and there are a range of things which are not necessarily in the system, which can also help. And by getting a list of the possible things you can think about helps, and that creativity about what can be done. And one of the things we have to do is actually build the ability of monitoring and evaluation units to have this tool set that they can apply in trying to get evaluation evidence used. So what are some of the emerging lessons? So there's a key thing about context being critical. And so again, the knowledge brokers, the M&E units, the people managing evaluation, they need to be aware of this, how significant the policy challenge or question is. And for example, is there a legal requirement for legislative review, which means that this is really topical and something needs to be done and the evaluation will be wanted? Or is there a crisis which can be a catalyst for change here? Or is the timing such that because we're just after an election, people are going to be open to exploring how things are working? Or are we 1 year before an election where policymakers' interests are not in this space at all? They're just in thinking about re-election. Yeah. And then the institutional environment. How is the institutional environment within individual departments or across government? So context matters. Make sure you understand it. Evaluation is a rational enterprise that takes place in a political context, and you need to understand that political context. Evidence use is also complex, and you need to think about what you need to do, for example, to build ownership, long before you may start an evaluation. How do you create the climate where that evaluation is wanted? How do you create the climate where the policymaker is asking for it? And that may take a year. It might take 2 years. And so the monitoring and evaluation units need to be evidence entrepreneurs. They're pushing for the opportunity to get evidence generated that can be useful. And this evidence use needs to be planned for and woven into the individual culture, but in the institutional culture. And a key, of course, is demand and how to get the demand. You obviously need to make sure there's credibility, quality, and legitimacy in the evidence journey. And this is very important so that the policymakers believe both the messenger and the message. Yeah. And then remembering this point I was saying, that don't just focus on instrumental use. The conceptual, symbolic, and process uses are just as important. And so don't just focus on the evaluation only being useful when the report comes out maybe a year later. It's useful from the minute you start asking the question, how was this intervention supposed to work? You know, what was its objective? Who were the key stakeholders? Immediately you start people thinking about the intervention and how it's working, and you start to have an impact. Now, I've got a couple of slides around knowledge brokering, which I'm not going to go in now, but we could come back to if they're useful, which is trying to explore. So one of the things we've done with the book is think about, well, how do we apply this knowledge? And one is, how do we build the capacity in government, but also in civil society, to be effective knowledge brokers? So we can come back to that later. I've got 2 slides on that. And so some other lessons. Passive provision of evidence doesn't work. Have an evaluation report and give it to them, and nobody's demanded it, it'll be a waste of time. They won't be interested. Similarly, even producing a good policy brief, but having no process which helps people to want the policy brief, it won't work. The process needs active facilitation and knowledge brokering. It's important to also have formal structures which manage the process, like evaluation steering committees, and use that to maintain ownership of stakeholders. And we need to build capacity of the managers, program managers, for example, decision makers and stakeholders. And then there are lots of points around packaging and communicating the evidence simply and effectively. We need to make sure, just because you think your evidence is important, doesn't mean the policymaker will think it's important. You need to make sure it's relevant to their policy concerns. We need to go beyond simply describing a problem and to providing practical and realistic solutions. So when we did evaluations, we would all afterwards do an improvement plan. And we only submitted our evaluations, this is in the national evaluations, we only submitted them to cabinet when we had the improvement plan, because we didn't just want to present the problem. We wanted to present, and this is what the plan is, to do something about it. Yeah. The evidence and recommendations often need to be specific, and evaluators sometimes produce rather generic recommendations. And we would work with the evaluators to try and make sure that the evaluations would. I mean, I realize I haven't sort of really introduced myself, but I actually set up and ran the national evaluation system in South Africa. So I was I was operating from the government side, trying to make sure that the evaluations were being produced, that they were good quality, and we would be working with the recommendations to make sure they weren't generic. They were as useful and relevant as possible. There's another point that came through, which is about values matter. And often you find that even in particular interventions, the values differ. For example, on violence against women and children, the values of the police and the values of the Department of Social Development were very different. And you have to mediate that to try and find a way forward in making an intervention which will work. So the police tend to go for punitive type things, whereas social development is looking for more, developmental ways for dealing with violence. So you need somehow to find ways to use your evidence to broker a conversation and get people to come up with something that is likely to work. And of course, you need formats which are readable and accessible. And so in South Africa, for example, we instituted a 25-page model. So the evaluator might produce a 100-page report, but we said, in addition to that report, we want a report with a 1-page policy summary, a 5-page executive summary, and a maximum 25-page main report. That's the summary report. And we knew that was the report that would actually be read. The long report, only those who were really, really motivated would read it. But this report was very important. And I, as head of the system, I read all those reports to make sure they were readable, that the logic was clear, that they were effective at communicating. So conclusions, the analytical framework is very helpful to be explicit about the behavior changes that are needed, and to try for those involved in the evaluation system to start to become conscious about what is needed to get evaluation evidence used. We can see examples of evidence use in the cases that we looked at, although we can't be sure on whether that had major impacts on society or development impact. And some of the key factors in the successful use of evidence to improve policy making include understanding the context, involving stakeholders continuously, ensuring there's demand for evidence as well as an appropriate supply, using the change mechanisms in a very purposive way to do active knowledge brokering, to try and make sure that the evidence will be used and will build the capability and motivation of policymakers. Making sure there's buy-in at higher levels and being entrepreneurs to find those moments in the policy process where this evidence is going to be welcomed. To do this effectively, the critical roles of process facilitation and knowledge brokering, soft skills, have to be given much more weight. People think about the technical skills. Do you know how to do an evaluation, or do you know how to analyze data? But do you have the skills to work with people so that they can understand why evidence is important and want to use it? Because if you don't, you've lost your audience before you started. The book, as I say, is available open access. Please do get it and download it. And also on the CLEAR website, we have videos on each of the cases as well as the lessons. We have policy briefs on each of the cases and the lessons in both English and French. We may even get some Portuguese soon. I'm afraid not Korean. But to try and make sure that they're accessible all across Africa. And finally, my concluding is that evidence use is complex, and it begins long before the actual evidence journey, the conducting the evaluation starts, and it needs to be planned for and woven into the culture. But it is a worthwhile investment. In South Africa, we came to, we did an evaluation of our national evaluation system, and we found that evaluations typically produced a return of between 1 to 7 and 1 to 13. So the investment in the evaluation was very worthwhile. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman. Thank you very much. Actually, I had a lot of questions in my mind now, but I think since I'm the moderator today, I'd like to give opportunities to our colleagues. We have a few colleagues here today from they're taking on various roles and responsibilities in policies, evaluation, and teaching and researching also. So I'd like to maybe I can hand a microphone to Professor Kwak. Are you able to turn on your microphone? Sure. Yeah, thank you.
And back to the stage now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for both of you for organizing such a beautiful session, especially Ian. And as I typed in, I'm very much enlightened by your presentation, especially on guiding evidence-based evaluation. Especially your conceptual DOC model is very impressive. And I totally agree. One important precondition seems to be the establishment, the readiness of change mechanism for institutional opportunities. In other words, the bureaucratic readiness or robust administration system of the country is extremely important. I understand the South Africa is a forerunner, but can you exemplify or specify some good examples in other countries, possibly in Africa? You mentioned like Uganda case or some other cases as well. Enlighten us with some other cases, examples.
So, for example, if I take, so what I'm going to do is pick where people use some of these interventions to try and, facilitate the use of evidence. So for example, in Ghana and in Uganda and in South Africa, we ran training of senior managers in the public service. So this was in South Africa's case, it was 350 of the top 3 ranks of the public service, including 16 of what we call directors general. So they're the heads of a department, or a ministry. And so we did this to try and get them to understand why evidence was important, why evaluation was an important source of evidence, but also why research and data were important, and how it could benefit them, and to try and change the culture from them seeing evaluation as punitive to them seeing evaluation as helping them to perform better, and therefore that they would do better in their performance agreements, and their politicians could potentially be happier, etc., etc. So both Benin, Ghana, Uganda, South Africa all ran this course, and it was important. In the rapid synthesis example, which was in Uganda, it's a very interesting example. At Makerere University, there's this unit called ACRES, ACRES is the acronym. I can't remember the chapter number in the book, but they do rapid syntheses of evidence for policymakers, mainly in the health sector. And the interesting thing, if you read that chapter, is they talk about a national one, which is around fortification, food fortification. And they talk about one that happened in the district, where a district approached them to give them evidence of how to improve TB, uptake of TB medicine. And they then looked at the evidence to see that. So that was a Ugandan one. And then in the Ghana case, there was training of citizen groups at local level, as well as NGOs at national level, to do knowledge brokering, but the local groups to how to analyze and utilize data so that they would demand accountability and better services. And that was particularly around services provided at local government level. So water, roads, those types of electricity, those types of services. So this table, I think, shows examples that come from the different countries, where we could see examples of where they were active. The use interventions were triggering particular mechanisms, and that was contributing. I can go through more if you want to, but I think that's illustrating the principle.
Yeah, definitely. We should discuss more about that. And also in Korea, we are heavily discussing about the possibility of inviting those high-ranking officials to alarm the importance of the monitoring and evaluation. Well, it could be like a long-term master's degree program, or it could be the short-term ones as well. Both have pros and cons, but in this, you have much more rich experience in that. But we should be in the same page in the institution building, through the capacity building of those key decision makers. Thank you so much.
We did a 2.5-day course, which is what we thought these very high-level officials is the most they would agree to do. We did it with the top university.
Yeah.
That was with the top university in Africa, the University of Cape Town. It was at a wine farm, so it was a lovely venue. So they would want to be there. It was prestigious. Do you know what I mean? And so we were trying to raise the profile. So they didn't see this as, it wasn't like a normal training. It was more advocacy. Yeah. And we had very, it was a very well organized program with very good presenters. We got presenters to do like TED Talks, very short talks, very punchy. You know what I mean? Giving examples of how research or data or evaluations had made a difference. So high quality presentation, high quality process, etc.
Yeah, please let us know when you have a next session like this. I mean, it will be very interesting, like a point for us, learn and observe what actually going on in a beautiful city of Cape Town.
Especially if it happens held in a winery, then why not? Well, just in regards to what Professor Clark said, I wonder what's the role of the global international evaluators and evaluation specialists, so-called from the global north here, in any of these evaluations, maybe conducted by a lot of African specialists. So maybe there's a culture of a lot of larger scale evaluations are conducted by sponsored by banks. Any of these contexts could be included in this analysis?
So, for example, in the Uganda case, it was the World Bank that was supporting the review of public procurement, and the work went to international tender. And in fact, it was an Indian company which won the tender that did the evaluation. So, but in most of the cases in the book, it was actually local institutions, local evaluators, local evidence people that were doing it. So.
And there are a few questions in the chat box. If any of our colleagues would like to turn on microphone, could you go ahead? Or I could read. I think that I can read one of just a question came up in the chat box from Dr. Lee, Ian Zhao. Thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned a cost-benefit analysis, benefit of an evaluation in SA was estimated. I think you mentioned in a slide. Is a part of the study you presented? If not, could you provide a reference? I wonder what would be the main cost and benefits included in the analysis.
Okay, so I'm just posting in the chat the paper that was written about that evaluation, so which talks about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Meanwhile, do you have? Would you like to explain something, or would you? Should we get next question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of detail in there which things were covered, and in fact, we can actually. I think the evaluation report is now public, so I can actually get it for you, which goes into more detail, obviously, on what they looked at. And they took 3 cases. There were 3 different evaluations that were done. They looked at. It's a difficult thing to look at the costing because you've got to try and look at the costing of the M&E units, which is overseeing the evaluations. There's the cost of the individual evaluation itself, and what do you include or not include. So it's definitely not a simple thing to do, but it was one of the key things I wanted them to do, because I knew that for us to justify evaluation, we had to say it's cost effective.
Okay. Yeah. I think that we might, I think we have some time to accept a few more questions. I think that Dr. Shin.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Dr. Goldman. I would love to read your book as soon as possible after this session. The topic was extremely interesting personally, and also I've been wondering about this issue in all my career, actually, so it was very relatable. Among your presentations, I totally agree with you almost on everything. In terms of Korea's context, we actually talked about it in last couple of days during this conferences, that there is a gap between the evaluation practice and policy, evidence-based program designing and policymaking in international development field within Korea. But then compared to the regular domestic policy evaluation of Korea. So as Professor Hong mentioned, that Prime Minister's office are making effort to improve the evaluation system, but it's regarding the evaluation of international development programs, not for domestic policies and programs. And
okay.
yeah, and as a researcher and a scholar, studying policy evaluation, and I personally do evaluations both for domestic policies as well as international development policies and programs. So I feel the difference in the temperatures in this for this evaluations of domestic policies and international development programs.
Especially in the section of M4 and M5, right?
Yes,
exactly.
M4 and M5, and also M1 and M2 as well. So I think for the international development programs, a lot of stakeholders in Korea are aware of the importance of the evidence, and a lot of institutions, including domestic institutions, the government affiliated institutions, as well as the NGOs of Korea, are highly aware of this importance of evidence. They value the evaluation practices as well as the processes and the results. But in terms of the evaluations of domestic policies, I feel like the evaluation is done because it has to be done, and when the report is out, nobody reads it until some policymakers want to criticize policies that had implemented before to attack some other policymakers. Then they look up these reports and then use it as an evidence for argument and make more conflicts, not using these evidences for better policies. So I was wondering, well, you talked about this, how this prestigious high-level meetings were quite effective to increase the awareness. If you have an experience regarding to improve the awareness of this high-level officials who actually needs to incorporate these evidences and understand the values of these evidences, and also to increase the commitment. Because one of the reasons why the evaluations of the international development programs of Korea is keep on improving is because our commitment to the international society regarding these evaluations and programs to provide effective international development programs. Although Korean government on the surface are obliged to do annual evaluations for all the domestic programs, I don't think even though a lot of capable evaluation practitioners and officials are making effort to do these evaluations, I don't think the outcome and the product of the evaluation is being well utilized at all. So if you have any advice based on your experience for the practitioners who are suffering from this environment, it'd be very much appreciated.
So, there's a question of how committed government is to do this. So there was a real commitment in our government, and in fact in Uganda and Benin, to use evaluation in a proactive way to improve performance. If that doesn't exist centrally, then it might be the best way is to start with a ministry that is interested. And you start to build some examples and create a model. But you have to, we had, in a sense, the sponsor of the course for the evidence-based policy course I mentioned was the Director General in the presidency. And our department, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation that I worked in, was in the presidency. So we had this sort of overall role to drive planning, monitoring and evaluation. And the director, so the letters of invitation to the course came from the Director General in the presidency.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So it's trying. So you need to think about how you get that political sponsorship and the authorization for it. And if you can't get it centrally, you might have to try it in a ministry and start building, or maybe even in Parliament, using Parliament as another approach to try and do this.
Thank you very much. I found this quite
Thank you.
interesting. Also, in previous presentation, Dr. Moker also mentioned parliamentarians.
So we've done. I mean, there's also a book that that Claire's been involved in on African parliaments and how they use evaluations and how they use evidence. And I can try and find that link. So Parliament is important because I think all too often government tries to keep it. It actually doesn't want things transparent, doesn't want things public. It doesn't want to expose where things are not working. So by having Parliament having to look at it. So in South Africa, for example, all our evaluations were sent to Parliament. So they could see, and then often we would go and present the evaluation to a particular portfolio committee that was covering a particular department that was relevant to that. Okay, here we go. I'll put it in the chat. To that particular, evaluation, and in some cases, parliamentarians really used it. In some cases, they didn't.
Oh, this is fascinating.
I think all our evaluation reports are also sent to Parliament in Korea as well, but it's just not receiving as much attention it needs to be.
Actually, I had a very interesting meeting with one of the congressmen last year, and he was looking for the scandals rather than development outcomes.
Yeah.
So the meeting was very interesting.
Yeah, the hopeful side is that some of the local governments are doing some social experimental evaluations regarding the stimulus package and the upcoming another additional stimulus package as well. Like cities such as Jeonju in Korea and also Seoul, the mayor has a very huge motivation regarding this experimental evaluation. So hopefully some of the changes can happen from these local governments and these city ministries, and then it can lead to more attention to this evidence-based policymaking.
Definitely.
I think your book should be translated in Korean and just distributed to all these congressmen in Korea.
Definitely. Well, we have a really interesting one more question came up about knowledge brokering. I'm actually I'm doing a few works related to this. It's very interesting area, but very hard to conceptualize this area. Could you explain a little bit more about it? I think you've been right. You have been one of the our participants today. Just uploaded the question in the chat box.
Yeah, so I put a policy brief in the chat box that we've written on this, but basically we see these three core roles. One is as facilitators and linkage agents, where you facilitate knowledge-based networks and process. You manage the context and facilitate the relationships. You facilitate the process of the evidence journey. So before the evaluation, going through the evaluation process, getting the evaluations presented to management, producing the improvement plans, all that whole process needs to be facilitated. And if it's well facilitated, it builds trust and it builds, interest along the journey. Then there's the knowledge management. What are you doing in terms of making sure that the knowledge is coming out in a concise way, readable, that it's effective. Have you got the right repositories available so people can access it? So, and then there's work on actually developing capacity. You may have to build individual and institutional capacity to produce and use policy relevant knowledge. So, for example, in our department, we developed and ran a number of courses in evaluation so that people would be able to do it. And then there's that course I mentioned for senior policymakers as well. So all these three roles are important. And I don't think we've got time now, but in the policy brief, we talk about some of the characteristics of a knowledge broker that are needed, looking at these three areas. So there's a very important table in the policy brief where we try and unpack that.
Wonderful. Just quick question, building on that. Do you, like traditionally evaluators should take a standpoint as an objective, critical evaluator who, evaluate others' work. Are there any clashes of the different roles and responsibilities being a facilitator, a knowledge broker versus being an evaluator?
So the knowledge an effective evaluator has knowledge brokering skills because they know how to communicate, how to build trust, etc. But the knowledge broker we're thinking particularly is the intermediaries, like monitoring and evaluation units in government, who have to both assure the supply, assure the demand, and make sure that the evidence is actually used.
Okay, thank you. I think for the details, we'll read your policy briefs and then we will ask more questions in the future. I think the times are almost up, so we have to wrap up this session. Professor Kwak, would you like to, as a president of our evaluation society, would you like to have a say or have some concluding remark?
Above all, we are non-frill organization without any formalities.
Yes.
Just want to say thank you so much, especially despite your tight schedule. This may be our first encounter, but I'm sure this is not the last. And also for everyone participating in the conference, we'd like to make a better side. So please leave any message or suggestions. We want us to how to react, how to move forward in the future. That's it. Thank you very much. All the best.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good night. Thank you.